And as that disembodied voice just informed you all, this meeting is being recorded. We're making a recording of this meeting so that the things that we learn here today we can share with others, and we can reflect back on the lessons that we've learned. I want to acknowledge the committee that helps in planning these: Jason Lee, Jenny Brangen, Amy Basil, Amanda Angola, and myself. Have been pulling together starting this summer these Focus on Action Voices from the Field series, really taking on the issue of how social workers can support Black lives in meaningful and direct ways. We are so excited to have this panel today. It is so important and so timely to think about the engagement of Black social workers in the political process, whether it's running or helping with campaigns or legislating or lobbying for policy. And we have people at different points in their careers with expertise and experience on each of those aspects. So I'm so excited to have these panelists here. A couple of housekeeping things. I guess we have mostly people can hear, right? Okay. Great. So we'll just hope that one gets solved for Christy and that we're set. So housekeeping things. First of all, please mute your mic. We'll work through the chat for questions. So please draw things into the chat. If you've got some questions or concerns, put them there and mute your mic. Know you're recorded. And keep an eye on this series because there will be more panels in the future. But now I'm going to turn it over to the panel. I want to just briefly introduce each of the people who are with us today and explain some of our thinking on this panel. Perhaps this is one of the most obvious ideas possible for the month of October. We are 2 months from an election, a national election. If you didn't know that, then you you probably aren't living in this country. It's a very intense time. I think we think of these kind of interlocking crises that are going on right now. Sometimes we separate them, calling them the COVID pandemic, the national reckoning with race, and the deep challenges to our institutions that uphold the structures of democracy in the United States. I think it's very easy to understand that those are three aspects of very closely related phenomena. They are demonstrating again and again the same tensions in the American democratic fabric. And so, as we face this national reckoning of race and the question of these institutions and the questions of making Black Lives Matter, when COVID so clearly demonstrates the deep disparities, exposes and exacerbates the deep disparities that this nation generates, well, then that's a time to talk about politics. And we have invited three experts with different perspectives and experience. So I'll quickly name them all and then we'll turn it over and hear from each one of them where they'll introduce themselves and their work to you. But today I'm very pleased to have joining us from Maryland, Dr. Charles Lewis, who is the director of the Congressional Research Institute for Social Work and Policy. From now on, we'll call that CRISP because the name is too long. But he has long experience in DC, chairing the Social Work Caucus, working for legislators, lobbying from the outside. Oh, we need someone to mute. So it wasn't a guardianship case. And thank you. And bringing a long experience of teaching in schools of social work, advocating on campus, running CRISP, and having worked on the Hill. Also joining us today, Brian Benford, who got his MSW from our program last year, but after a long career before getting his MSW, including serving on the Madison Common Council and recently just running for the state legislature. And we also have Nerissa Vogt, who graduated from the program last year as well, and was in the Policy and Administration Field Unit with me, and has served as the executive assistant to the director of the Democratic Party of Wisconsin since graduating, and so has had a very intense electoral crash course in the last 7 months. So I just want to start there. We'll start with Dr. Lewis and have each one of you kind of introduce yourself, what the work you do, what work you do, and how what you're doing right now and how you're thinking about this political moment, just mostly on what you're doing.
Okay.
Dr. Lewis.
If I tell you about all of that, nobody else will have time to speak. So I'm just, hi, Kristen, good to see you. So yeah, I am a self-identified political social worker. Didn't plan to be a political social worker. When I went back to school to finish my education after a long hiatus and decided to go into social work, I was going into clinical counseling like most social workers do. And then I discovered policy in my one of my MSW classes. And then I decided, you know what, we need more people at the policy level. And I went to Columbia and got a PhD so I could be at the table. So so as I was teaching policy for a while, and then but for me, I was never really the academic guy type. I wanted to be out there in the world doing things and making things happen. And so Mr. Ed Towns, who was a congressman from Brooklyn, where I had lived most of my life, when the Dems took over the House in 2006, and he got the chairmanship of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee. You know, he had a lot of staff, and he invited me to join his staff on the Hill. And so I spent 4 years on the Hill with Mr. Towns, and during that period of time met Nancy Humphreys, who was espousing political social work for a couple of decades before then. And so, having thought I was leaving social work to go into politics when I went on the Hill, I discovered, no, I'm not. I'm always a social worker, and I take my social work with me into the political arena. And so I've been working since Mr. Towns retired in 2013 with PRISP, and to get more social workers engaged in the political arena. Particularly, Chris focuses on Congress at the federal level, but obviously there's a need for engagement on all levels. We have a representative democracy, and so it doesn't end November 3rd, regardless of what happens. Okay, it begins, and that means that people whoever we elect on up and down the ballot, they are working for us, and we have to hold them accountable, engage them, support them when we can, but always be engaged with our elected officials. And I'll stop there for now.
Thank you so much. It doesn't end on November 3rd is something we probably should all put on our bumper stickers. So Brian, how about a little quick introduction to you?
Great, thank you, Laura. It's really an honor to be here with Dr. Lewis, Nerissa, and you all. My name is Brian Benford. Currently, I'm the success coach at the UW-Madison Odyssey Project. Going on its 18th year, Odyssey is a free, life transformative, year-long course in the humanities for adults facing barriers and challenges to reaching their full potential through education. I should note that I'm a proud alumnus of this program. Just to give you a little context of my political journey, I was born in Milwaukee in 1959, and our family was firmly entrenched within the civil rights movement in Milwaukee. My grandmothers were early social justice activists in Milwaukee's Black community. As a child, I attended St. Boniface School when Father James Groppe, who was a prominent civil rights leader, was the parish priest. At the age of 5, I began marching with Father Groppe and thousands of others for better opportunities for Blacks living in Milwaukee. Despite my young age, I completely understood that we were fighting for access to decent housing, better schools, jobs, the end to police brutality, and everything else needed to reach our full potential. Sadly, not much has changed since the 60s. In 1968, during the riots in Milwaukee, my family left the inner city and I moved to the all-white rural farm community of Fort Atkinson. So I could write a novel about my experiences growing up as the first Black child in over 100 years to attend Fort Atkinson schools. But I wanted to say that the yoke of racism was firmly placed around my neck at that time, and I still carry it to this day. While I endured years of prejudice, I walked away with a profound love of diversity and all its beauty and possibilities. And you might say that it was my beginning of an unending path to being culturally competent. I like to joke, I'm convinced that I might be the only Black man in Wisconsin that can dance polka while listening to hip hop and rebuilding a John Deere tractor. So growing up in Ford, I developed a lifelong love of nature and all things wild, but I also came to a really important understanding that if you strip away the external things that separate us, like skin color, wealth, religion, it's easy to focus on the commonalities that bind us, like our love for our children, our families, our deepest desires for freedom, the right to reach our full potentials to love who we decide to love. So I'm deeply grateful that growing up in a multicultural environment afforded me these insights. These insights help my engagement as a longtime family advocate, educator, activist, volunteer, and former policymaker. As Laura mentioned, I'm a former alderperson for the City of Madison and past president of the City of Madison's Equal Opportunities Commission. I've served on over 15 City of Madison committee, commissions, and boards, which gave me valuable insight into public policy. And as an alder, my primary focus was to open the doors to public policy for all. So for over the last 30 years, I've served to support marginalized, vulnerable children, their families, individuals, and communities to reach their full potentials. So as Laura mentioned, after I graduated in May, I looked around and I was deeply disturbed, not only because of COVID-19, but for decades prior, all the trauma and challenges that so many people in our community face. So we ran a true grassroots campaign for the Wisconsin State Senate because, quite frankly, I was tired of being represented by misinformed, indifferent, or ineffective white policymakers. So while we didn't win, I feel like we did a great job in raising the level of awareness around some critical issues and to empower others to take a look at the political process. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Brian. It's a great introduction. And now we'll turn to Nerissa and hear from her.
Hi, everyone. I am Nerissa. I wish I could have gone first because I have a much less impressive resume than the other two panelists. I also graduated from UW-Madison in May with Brian, with my master's in what I describe to other people as political social work, or I say social work policy and administration. I feel like it's my perception of political social work is it's relatively new and it's relatively still kind of a growing and small community, and it's hard to get folks, specifically women, on board, or specifically women and my other peers that are social workers, on board with politics in general. I decided to choose the political path. I think it sort of hit me when I was doing my BSW internship back in Illinois. I did my internship at the Elgin Police Department. They had an open door policy, and a lot of my clients were homeless individuals that would come in seeking services. And a lot of times, so I would say about 75 to 80% of my capacity to help them was inhibited by policies. And that's both local, state, and federal policies. So, for example, local policies with local homeless shelter. I couldn't get handful, which I only had a handful of clients, into our homeless shelter based on the fact that they were banned because zero tolerance rule for marijuana, and them having marijuana like on their person while they were at the homeless shelter. So that was one aspect of it. The other aspect on like a federal level or more of a state level was I had a hard time helping clients get into the homeless shelter because they didn't have an ID, and they couldn't get IDs because they didn't have permanent addresses, and they couldn't have permanent addresses because they didn't have anywhere to live. And looking at the system and like the systems theory that we learned day one in social work, and seeing that direct micro practice is so important, but it's so incredibly limited if we don't have policies in place that are going to support social workers and allow them to support their clients. So that's what really influenced me to focus on politics and policy in my master's. I'm currently working at the Democratic Party of Wisconsin as the executive assistant. My day-to-day tasks, and I also would like to mention, I feel super lucky because our director is somebody that, excuse me, but has her shit together. And she's super like forward, and I feel like I can talk to her as if she is also another social worker, and she's really taking our state party to like another level. And I really think that in November, we're all going to be really excited and really pleased with the outcome. But what I do day to day, I like to explain my job as I'm not maybe the engine, and I'm maybe not the steering wheel or even the wheels or tires, but I'm very much the oil. And if you don't get the oil changed, the car doesn't work. So I'm basically the oil that's making everything move and happen. And I'm managing schedules. I'm telling people no, I'm telling people yes. I'm lucky enough to have this person as a mentor that's allowing me to participate in small projects and tasks in other departments, and she's fully supportive of the fact that this is my foot in the door, and I really want to work with in 2022 at this rate, and like not this election cycle, but next election cycle, working with candidates and specifically candidates that are sharing like what I perceive are social work values and getting them into office, and that's really what's important to me. I feel very lucky to be there and have somebody that supports that role. So all in all, my goal is to take social work values and in any tiny way insert them into politics and policy, even if it's, you know, unmuting myself during a meeting and saying, maybe we should think of this, like always just being what my classmate Khadijah would say as the squeaky wheel, the social work squeaky wheel. And yeah. And like I mentioned, I'm only 25, so I'm still figuring it out, and it's an iterative process.
I gotta say, Nerissa, you landed the squeaky wheel and the oil metaphor. Pretty beautiful unity on that. So, you know, we can all use good metaphor work in addition to social work skills. And Nerissa was just touching on the way that social work values and social work skills inform her practice in political social work, if we're calling this sort of broadly political social work. So I would love to hear from all three of you a little bit more about that. Do you see how social work is informing or being informed by what your approach to social work informs your work in politics, or your work in politics is informing what you're thinking about social work ethics, skills, and values? Anyone want to step up to that?
Well, I'll say I think it works both ways. I think that one of the reasons we need more social workers in the political arena is because we do take our values into that space, and it's needed. You know, our certain skills we have that we hone, like listening, is very important in that space. And so yes, I think, you know, but at the same time, I think what when we look at what's going on in our country and even in our localities, each Wisconsin's got its own set of challenges, um, but uh, so it kind of speaks to what social workers need to be focused on, and it calls to us to look for opportunities to make change. I'll give you one example of something that I'm doing. And so, like I said, this Life Beyond on November 3rd, I believe. Um, so, uh, so I'm planning a briefing for a congressional briefing. These are some things we do to raise awareness among social workers about critical issues that where we could make a difference. So, you know, eventually the entire system needs to change, and I'll talk about that later. But right now, I'll just focus on one thing that I think we can do that will make a difference. And so, form of the late Elijah Cummings introduced a bill last year called the Redeem Act, and what it would do is provide expungement and sealed records for nonviolent offenders who have gone for 5 years without any further connection engagement with the criminal justice system. At the end of that 5 years, your records would be automatically sealed, so you don't have to go and appeal and petition that. And so we're going to have a discussion about this, because I believe this is one way to undo racism. I mean, it's a practical way, because so many people have been scarred by our over emphasis of incarceration and criminal penalties, so that for many, you get a felony, it's a life sentence. It follows you wherever you go. In terms of trying to get a job, try to increase your education, start a business, get a license. There's so many barriers that a felony presents to people. So to me, it's a no-brainer that if someone who may have done something dumb, nonviolent, is able to get their act together and not, and get their lives on the right direction, that they should get relief from these felonies. And so I'm just saying that's one example of where I think my social work thinking made me grab onto this particular issue.
If you don't mind, maybe I'll jump in. I really appreciate Dr. Lewis's comments so much. And I should make a full disclosure that I can't identify as a social worker until I write this APSW and get licensed from the state. But as Laura mentioned, for the last, for 3 decades, I've worked in community-based organization performing social work duties. So I tend to be a visual person. And if you could close your eyes and imagine this, imagine if politicians by law, by state law, had to subscribe to our code of ethics. So if I read politicians' primary goal is to help people in need and to address social problems, or if I said politicians challenge social injustice, or if I said politicians represent the inherent dignity and worth of the person, and you all know our ethical principles, and I could go on. So, before I went back to school, and I should say that when I read the Code of Ethics from social work, I was still undecided. I went back to school later in life, as I mentioned, and I was still somewhat undecided. But when I read those Code of Ethics, I was like, Eureka, this is it. This is the profession that I can lay my hat from all my political activism and the interests that I have. So, I did my internship, my final year of the MSW program at the state capitol. in a legislator's office. And I walked out of there thinking I've just witnessed the most dysfunction, most corrupt place within walking distance to anyone. And so I definitely feel that there's a need. And I often joke upon my friends that if all politicians would agree to sign on to our code of ethics, imagine how great this world could be.
Thanks, Brian. Nerissa, you want to weigh in on social work ethics and values?
Yeah, absolutely. I say all the time that if every college student, like obviously I mentioned I'm 25, so my brain is still a bit collegey, was required to take more than 1 or 2 social work classes, the world would be so much better off. And yeah, I would say that social work values and ethics very much influence how I do my job. I would say how I got my job. For those of you that are not yet graduated, and how I like exist in my organization. I think that a lot of times, so for context, my position falls underneath the executive like level, but I myself am not an executive position. I just attend all of the meetings, like organize, like carry them out, take notes. But I do have the capacity to give input during them. I will say that something that I'm coming to learn and coming to grips with, and I feel like Brian, you might be able to, you would agree and understand what I mean when I say this, because I looked at your campaign page when you were running, and I just also want to congratulate you on running. That's really awesome. That being or identifying as a Democrat is not synonymous with, obviously not synonymous with social work values, but also not synonymous with being a good person. And I think that as a younger person coming into politics, I gravitate towards the Democratic Party because a lot of candidates and a lot of people in state and federal legislation and Congress also appear to share those values. But I think that's something that I'm learning, is that that's not always the case, and that being a social worker and having a social work background is so much more specific and unique than like anything else. And really having that background and that dedication to values and that code of ethics it's very, very, very different. It's a different type of person to be a social worker in Congress than just a Democrat in Congress. And I think that's something that I'm learning and I'm okay with. And yeah, it's just, I'm still in the learning process and like the digestive process of it all when it comes to values and how I'm using it in my job. And I will say, like, the biggest like source of tension is feeling like, here I'm at the Democratic Party with these people and I feel like I should share everything and like be on board, and then seeing that there's some candidates running in some areas with a very problematic record, and I'm like, shouldn't you be running for the Republican Party? Like, there's some disconnect, and I think that that's the tension and something that I'm just coming to terms with and still working on understanding how that works. And there's still a whole part of this ballgame that I don't understand yet.
I really appreciate that, Nerissa, bringing that kind of the sense of the tension and the sense of these mysteries, because in some ways, right, like Brian's discussion, imagining what it would be like to really hold these values. But I think sometimes we see these operating these values in a social or political sense as a kind of subunit of the whole field anyway, right? That this isn't always, you're understood to be political social workers, but we also understand that that can be not the center of the profession in some ways, and so I think that's one of the tensions too. And I just wondered, Dr. Lewis, if you wanted to follow up on some of what Nerissa was just saying, which I'm sure you've grappled with a lot about party identification and values. Just if you want to circle back.
Well, our system has become really polarized in the last 3, 4 decades. I mean, there were times when there was a time when there was a moderate Republican and a conservative Democrat, but then we have evolved to a point where we're become so tribal in our sense of political identity that when we identify ourselves as either an R or a D, it just automatically influences our thinking and our decisions and what we're going to support. Um, so yeah, I think social work values break through all of that. One interesting fact that I like to share with audiences that maybe help us understand how valued our profession is and how valued that degree is that, and maybe some of you might know this, but Karen Bass, Representative Karen Bass in California, who was on the short list for the vice presidency, went into Congress at, I believe, around 2011. She was elected to Congress. She got her MSW in 2015. So she got her MSW after she went to Congress, and I think she was in her late 50s. So for her to do that says a lot in terms of her valuing the skills and knowledge and values that social work brings, and she is indeed she was charged with developing a policy agenda for child welfare for the Biden campaign, and she reached out to a number of us, for some comments on some of the items that they were doing. So we can influence what's happening in our government. There's a number of ways to get engaged with in the political arena. You don't have to run for office. Everybody doesn't have to run for office. I mean, some people can be staff people if they like, but then there are, you can be in an advocacy role, with like a children's defense fund and a legislative person who lobbies, so to speak, on the Hill. But we have to be involved in determining what the policies are going to be in order to who besides us will speak for the poor.
Excellent. I want to, I know we were focusing first on the kind of social work identity, but obviously the other theme of this panel and this whole series has been about making Black Lives Matter through social work, and your identities as Black political social workers are surely influencing the way you think about this political moment and what you think is possible right now and what is necessary right now. And so I wonder if each of you would speak a little bit to that, how your racial identity is informed or helped to contribute to where you see fitting in this political work and how you're doing it. Does anybody want to go first?
I'd be happy to jump
Thanks,
in.
Brian.
Yeah, so I hate preaching to the choir, and I think it goes without saying that Wisconsin has the worst racial inequality in the United States on so many levels, whether it's incarceration rates, employment, wage gap, educational gaps, housing disparities. So over the last, I mentioned I'm 61. I'm a proud father of 5 beautiful kids, 4 that are adults. So growing up, when they were growing up, when I looked into the mirror, I saw the face of poverty, and that gave me many commonalities with those that I served that allowed me to build rapport, understanding, and a deeper calling to action to make positive change. So I think when I was elected to the Madison City Council, I was only the fourth Black alder elected in the history of the city. And when you look at the recent change in the Wisconsin Assembly, I'm really happy that I see more diversity of people running in races, in particular in the race that I ran, and there were five people of color in that race. So back in 1979, when I first moved to Madison, I never would have imagined that. So when I think about my intersectionality of race and socioeconomic status and everything else that makes who I am, I feel like I bring that to the table. And over the last 3 decades serving all the people that I have, I carry all of them in my heart as I ran for public office. And as Dr. Lewis said, you don't have to run for office. I'm not sure I would recommend that to anybody, but you can get involved in so many ways. So just like what we do in our regular practice to engage, to listen, to empower, to educate, we can do that on the political realm. Years ago, I was a coordinator of what was called the Grassroots Leadership College, where we took emerging leaders and teamed them up with seasoned leaders so they could go back in their communities to impact positive change. So as social workers of color, or regardless of your background, I think it's really important that we start doing that to forge a new future.
That's great.
I'll say that being a person of color and a social worker and working on this campaign during this time, I feel like the intersection of social worker and like Black woman makes everything 150 times heavier than I feel like it might be for others. Especially, I think that's something that I struggle with is like appreciating that we're magnifying and paying attention, but also being overwhelmed and exhausted by it and like not being able to hide from it. And then also going to work and there's no way to escape it in work because it's just, it's like right now that's a talking point for a lot of politicians and people running for office. So I feel like one aspect of it is it's exhausting and I'm tired and I'm sad and it's a lot, but like also I'm enlightened and I feel empowered because I understand. And I think that my voice at my organization is listened to and respected in a way I think I feel like it is because I feel confident in what I'm saying because I have a social work background and a social work education. And it's one of those things where the squeaky wheel doesn't feel that scary because I know that the frequency in which I'm squeaking is the right one. And so I don't really even remember what the question was, but just the thought that I had. And I think all of those things, intersectionality, like Brian mentioned, subconsciously and like consciously are what make me really good at what I do. I think what are going to make me really good at what I do when I move into a different position. And it's also something that I constantly have to check myself on, like hashtag self-care, and like be really conscious of that because it's a different type and level of pressure, in my opinion.
Thanks.
So I was Brian, having worked on campaigns, I appreciate you going in there and doing that, man. We do, and I'm not saying we need social workers running for office, and we encourage social workers to run for office, even though that's not the only thing that we have to do. So I admire those who do. I decided a while back that it wasn't for me. Maybe if it was a different time. So maybe if I was a little younger, now I might jump into the ring. One of the things I want to say in terms of racial identity. So I had a unique experience, I believe, growing up. I was in gifted classes when I was from elementary school. So I was I was in a mixed class, mostly white class, but so I got to know white people and work. I tutored my white students, so I never had any sense of inferiority or anything like that. So it's always so like white people are people to me, like anything else. And so I never had that problem to deal with. However, one of the things that I have intentionally did is to make CRISP and the work we do multiracial. Right? It's and sometimes it's not easy because I'll tell you, some of my black students when I was at Howard, they didn't want to work with white people, and I could understand that, and that's why we have a National Association of Black Social Workers, because they feel that they could not be fully engaged and reach their potential in the majority National Association of Social Workers. So they created their own, and and so there are times when Black people may have to get together to take care of some special things that is related to them. LGBTQ people have to. I'm just saying those groups need to come together when they need to. But at the end of the day, this is only going to get solved if we have broad racial coalitions. All right. Recently, I wrote a post, and I wrote a post where I said racial equity is going to be hard to achieve in an oligarchy. All right. You have to think about that. All right. Because as hard as we are working for racial equity, we're working, that's the buzzword on campuses now, everything, conferences, everything's racial equity, and so having been around for a little while, I get a little skeptical. Is this the moment? Like, is this the reckoning that's going to be different than the other reckonings that we've had? So, but it can be, and I believe it can be. But it's going to take a broad coalition of people working together, not just to create racial equity, because you got to deal with the system. We cannot let economic inequality continue unabated like it's been for so long, or we're all going to have a corrupt environment, and you cannot try to do this work. So you got to do both. All right, you got to pay attention to the structure of the economy and how to turn that around, and as well find ways to address some of the racial inequities.
Brian or Nerissa, did you want to follow up on that? I think that launches us into this really, I think it's a very hard space, and I appreciate Dr. Lewis sort of naming the both answer. Yeah. Okay. So incrementalism in social work and incrementalism in politics just came up in the question, and that's a good way to say it, and sort of where I was headed. I think there's some real serious tensions in this moment, evident in the way we're all thinking about policy. You think about the emergence of a really focused abolitionist movement in focusing on incarceration, focusing on child protective services, really demanding a much more radical change in these systems than has generally been offered by either party, really, right? So, and this gets back to your point, Dr. Lewis, that November 3rd isn't the day politics ends. It's the day politics starts in some ways, right? But I want you, I'd love to hear from all of you about thinking about this question as came in from Alex Smith. Thank you, Alex. What are you thinking about incrementalism and in politics, radical change, and what, do you have a theory of this moment and how to engage in it to get these systems to work better for, the populations you care about, especially, for Black people? I want to step up to that.
You want to speak again? Oh, go ahead.
I'm sorry. You go ahead.
I just asked her if she could ask the question again. I always need to hear it twice.
Well, I keep changing it, so I'm giving you a moving target. But I guess the question in some ways is, how do you think about very radical demands when you're working? Political spaces tend to be incremental spaces, right? Spaces of legislative and electoral spaces are spaces where we think about what's possible a lot. And okay, and then Bethany adds on full access to our authentic selves. We should come back to that one. I'm going to stick with the incrementalism question first, but I do want to come to that back to that one. Bethany, thanks. So that politics tends to create a kind of priority for possibility. And this moment is making some demands about things, reframing things in ways that could make more dramatic change. And I think there's a tension in political work about how we approach these deeply systemic issues. Does that make sense, Nerissa? It isn't easy to answer, but
Yeah.
does that make sense as a question?
I was going to say earlier that it's a fantastic question, and if you had the answer to it, they would probably name a religion after you, or you would win the Nobel Peace Prize at the very least. So I think about I mentioned earlier my background and all the things we were fighting for in the 60s: better housing, better schools, better employment opportunities, the end police brutality. We were fighting for those things in the 60s, and we continue to fight for it now. I think nowadays, with the political actions out in the street, that the thought of incremental change is uh, it's very daunting for many to think about that. I've seen here locally that because of political activism, that police were removed from schools. So while that was a process that took years to raise a level of awareness to get consensus, all of a sudden in these times that are just wrought with tension, that happened quicker than it probably would have. So I reflect back on my adult life, and I tried the best I could to fight for social justice causes and equity. But I think something that Dr. Lewis said, that in these dark and uncertain times dominated by two insidious diseases, that being COVID-19 and for centuries longer systemic racism and oppression, that now more than ever, we do need people from different backgrounds to come together and unity, respect, and love to forge a new, safe, and socially just and equitable world. So this is where I hold on to hope. I'm completely confident that if us as social workers truly follow the ethical principles that guide our profession, our experience and our skills can help make this new world a reality, because we're taught to engage, listen, educate, reflect on our biases, and ultimately advocate for those that we serve. So if we are to change the political landscape and put people before money and special interests, that now is the time to do this. So the thought of incremental change, it disturbs me, because I feel like for most of my life that I've had to endure that slow process.
Mm-hmm.
Let me say about incrementalism. It's part of the process, and I'll take small victories as well as transformative change. I mean, if we can get expungement on the books, and that takes the penalty of felonies from hundreds of thousands of people, make their lives better, I'll take it. Does it transform the criminal justice system? No. There's much more work that's going to be needed to transform the criminal justice system. A lot of that is at the front end, before the kids get involved engaged in the criminal justice system. How do we reduce risky behavior? We're talking about putting more social workers, nurses, and psychologists in schools. That's how you begin to transform the system as well. I mean, but we need some transformation in a couple of years ago, I read a book, Democracy in Change by Nancy McLean, and it struck me as a social worker. I'm saying, are we thinking about these? When she's writing about how our system is corrupt, the rules have been changed, and until we do something about it, not much is going to get done. And so I raised the question at one of our conferences: can social work help save democracy? Is that something that we think about as a profession, that we have the ability somehow to make those kind of, what can we do to help save democracy? And so some of the deans came together and we formed a steering group, and we're coming out with a social work democracy project. Now, the last thing I'll say, and then is that I think one of the game changers is going to be in this country is ranked choice voting. Okay, and I won't go into a whole lot of detail about it, but I do believe you're doing that in Wisconsin, or thinking about it, or talking about it. I thought I heard something about
What did you say?
Ranked choice voting.
Ranked choice.
Okay. Well,
they've talked about it for years, but especially in Wisconsin, the majority party likes cheating. they don't like that.
But I think there's going to be a movement soon. There was a bill introduced in the House for ranked choice voting by Jamie Raskin from Maryland. And if you're really interested in learning about it, there's a book I would recommend called The Politics Industry. The Politics Industry, because that book has given me more hope than I've had in a long time.
It is
And
good
I
to
don't know the author, so I'm not promoting it.
well, anything that brings optimism is a good thing right now. Nerissa, how about weighing in on this?
Yeah, I think that the question of like incremental change versus radical change is tricky, like because of perception, and what's perceived as radical is not a radical. And like, for example, addressing police brutality, and I know that's like such a large umbrella term, but like saying like, hey, maybe we shouldn't use so much force in these situations. On one news network is perceived as this radical idea of defund the police and oh my God, it's the end of the world. Look at what the radical right and left is doing. And our perception, if you agree with that, is like, that's not that crazy. Like that is an increment. Like, so I think it gets, like you can really get into the weeds with the idea of incremental change versus radical change based on who you ask. And I also think that the term radical has been like diluted and redefined to mean, and I'm speaking more of like from like a media perspective, like radical has somehow turned into like, we just really don't like that. We don't really like that idea. And that's how they use that as an adjective now. Whereas I think like the true meaning of radical is it's like, take it all apart and rebuild it in a better, more efficient way. It's like a legitimate like idea of radical, or like the legitimate definition. I guess it can just be so tricky because what is a better way is so different for every person, every type of person, every group of people. So I don't know. I think there always needs to be a balance of, we need like our radical champions and we need our incremental champions, and they need to be whispering in the background to each other, and then they need to be operating, and like that's how we can move forward with both types of change as long as like the two types of groups are talking. Like there just has to be two different kinds of champions for multiple, or not only two, like I guess a spectrum for multiple people who are paying attention, champion them on to get that change rolling.
Thanks so much, everyone. It is, I think, kind of an essential question, and these answers you've brought help people answer the question, because you have to answer it again and again. You don't get to answer it once. Like there's only one way to do this, I think. Political possibility and what's possible, but also what you can convince people is possible, and trying to change what is possible is part of the agenda. I want to really just we've got just about 20 minutes left. I want to talk a little bit more about this political moment, but before we do, I want to go back. I think something Bethany wrote into the chat also relates to that point that Nerissa said that I kind of want to take some time back on, that it is 150 times heavier, Nerissa said, from her position as a Black woman inside a largely white party structure, to be having to carry the weight of this moment, the deep, kind of grief and pain of this moment, but also the potential of it. And I think about how or where you see these dominant white spaces actually changing in relationship to how they're able to address, as Bethany says, address issues and actually make, this, what we often aspire to, this multiracial coalition, meaningful and mutual, rather than a like, well, we're here, why don't you come along because we're the big people in town kind of thing. And I did want to spend a little time on that because of Bethany's point, but also, Nerissa, the way you brought it about the 150 times extra weight, which, is something that I think a lot of us, know that people are experiencing, especially Black women, but I think, people of color in this moment, really heavy time.
Yeah. I promise I'm listening, but can you just ask the question again?
No, it wasn't really a question. It was like a big ramble. So the precise version of the question, I guess, is, do you see, I think, the way Bethany's saying is, part of the requirement is that white spaces change in regard to how they relate to the voices carrying these issues. And do you see that happening? I guess that's what I'm asking.
Yeah, I would say absolutely, but also so two parts. One, I think that I see white spaces changing, but the white spaces that I see changing have been influenced and led by white leaders who are accepting the fact that this system is flawed, and they're making an active choice to fix it. And then on the other side of things, there are people of color who are, who are working really, really hard to get the people who are in positions of power to recognize it, to make that change. But I'm speaking about where I'm working now, since that's what we're talking about, political social work. Like I said, I have a director who is very strategic. She's very much recognizes that she has what I will say, a human duty to make changes within the system. And I will say, as exciting as it is to work for this person, despite all the work that she's doing as one person, one individual, bringing all these ideas into a huge organization, on the executive board that consists of 10 people, there's 2 folks of color. One is me, and I'm not actually of senior leadership. I'm just there because I take notes. And the other person it's one other person, and the 2 of us are also mixed race. So we don't actually have somebody that's legitimately, and I'm not saying that I'm not legitimately a representative, but we don't actually have representation on that board. And that's still with somebody that is explicit and strategic, but it's just one person. It needs to be multiple people, and it's starting to be. So I don't want to sound cynical either. It's happening, and it will happen, and I know it will happen because there's literally no other option. It's just, we have to make it happen, and I don't want to get stuck into the politics of inevitability. Oh, it's just going to happen, and then people stop doing things. So I think that the idea that it's not an option to not happen needs to be put into the universe constantly, and then we also have to provide people with playbooks and the steps to take make it happen, so that we don't end up in that politics of inevitability, where we're just well, in the past it got better, so it's just going to get better, and we forget. I think that, and I'm just going to go on a tangent right now, and I think that a lot of the issues with moving a lot of, so two things that I want to say are like, one, history is taught really poorly in what I personally think in US schools, public schools specifically. And I am saying that as somebody that's 25 and like high school was far away, but like not really. Like I still clearly remember what I learned in history class, what I learned about Abe Lincoln, what I learned about all of the presidents, what I learned in US history is literally not accurate. It is literally like, I would dare to say 50% lies, 25% misinformation, and then like 25% just highlighting the good stuff. We gloss over we gloss over Black history. We give it 1 month out of the year. We talk about the guy that invented peanut butter, and like we don't actually have a good history on all of the hard work, like the hard work and the playbook from all that hard work that it took to get here. And so I think that people, and young people specifically, which is like, I'm not speaking for all young people, but that I'm a young person right now, like we forget that there is so much work. Like there's work. It's not just going to get better because it's inevitable. It got better because people busted their ass, because people marched, because people protest, because people burnt shit down. And like, I think like people from everybody needs to kind of accept the fact that we're in like a level of discomfort. Like I was an athlete and I feel like 2020 is like day 2 of a really hard workout where everything hurts and you feel like you just can't do it. Like protein, ice, rest, and you get stronger, you know? So I don't really even know what the question was anymore. I just need to share those thoughts.
That was perfect. Brian or Dr. Lewis, any add in on this or thoughts?
Well, it's the $1 million question. Did Bethany ask that question? I
Yeah.
appreciate that. So here it is, the pandemic, and I witnessed more soul searching, more deep reflection than I have any time in my life amongst white people, at least the white people that are in my orbit. So many book clubs, so many readings, so many sharing of, just new ways of thinking. And while that's encouraging, from my perspective, it really comes down to who's going to give up the power. So whether we're talking about the political realm or we're talking about community-based organizations that, the vast majority of them are managed and staffed by white people, who's going to walk away from it? So, I've worked in so many community-based organizations and they say, we're going to start this diversity community. We want to retain and recruit more people of color, and we really want you to be on it. And my question is who's walking away? What upper management? What person is walking away to create a seat at the table? So when I look at the political realm, it's the same thing. I had mentioned earlier that within Dane County, within state races, we have never seen so much diversity, never. And that's very exciting. But ultimately, there's a lot of lip service, but who's going to step away and create room for those other people to come in?
So I would say that most people, Black and white, feel that transformational change is beyond their wheelhouse. That they're not going to be directly part of making transformational change in this country. And I would kind of understand that, because if you go back to the 50s, 60s, where life was a lot different for a lot of reasons, things have changed dramatically because of a number of things. And one is the series of supply side tax cuts that we've experienced, as where tremendous amount of money, wealth, have been shifted to the very top 1% of the country. All right. So I know that sounds, for a lot of people, that's just, okay, that's a reality, but it's, what do you do about it? How do you change it? I think one of the things, it gets done in the political sphere. I think ultimately you can't keep electing people who do that, you know, and I don't know if the Senate flips in November and the supply siders are not empowered to enact another tax cut. Um, what you know? I'm saying, what would the Dems do? What they've got to have some ideas about how we and part of it is more progressive taxation. We all know this, all right? But getting it done is another story.
Absolutely. All right. We've got just under 10 minutes before we close this out at 1:15 our time. And I want to invite each one of you just maybe take us out on a high note. What's the importance to you of this political moment? What's the potential of it? What's the, getting through November 3rd, but getting something real after it too? What do you think that requires of us, of social workers? What inspires you right now, or what do you want to be inspired by? And what do you think everybody on this call needs to hear from you to make that most likely?
I'll say what's inspiring to me right now. Well, at my job specifically, how much grassroots fundraisers are, how well they're doing. And I think that that's inspiring because grassroots fundraisers are just everyone around contributing $10 and $20 at a time. It's not a bunch of rich people in Wisconsin donating $1,500, $1,600, $1,700 at a time, which all that money is well appreciated. But seeing that grassroots things, like regular schmegular people like myself, are paying attention and they're invested and they're excited about new candidates to come in, like Dr. Lewis, you mentioned, like electing people that are going to actually do the work or that they believe in, is something that's really exciting to me right now. And the amount of energy I see my coworkers putting into voter protection, and the amount of time and dedication and hours people are putting into not only negating strategic political misinformation, but making sure that there are resources in areas that are strategically being inhibited by other forces in terms of their vote and their voice. And that's something that's really exciting. And I hope that you guys are all paying attention to what's going on in the state right now. And if you don't live in this state, then another state, and getting involved in any way that you can.
Thanks, Nerissa.
So I am cautiously optimistic. I do believe that that things can change dramatically and in a short period of time. I think that one of the keys is leadership. Okay. Will the leadership, evolve? They always say that. What is it? Well, need is the mother of invention. So if we need leaders, okay, and I believe we have leaders evolving. I don't know, in different places. I mean, in our profession, particularly in Congress, on the Hill. Will that lead? Because I do believe that a lot of people have come to the understanding that if we don't do something, our whole system of governance and way of life could be in jeopardy.
So maybe I could just jump in here, and in this world, I often feel like I'm walking this fine balance between this despair because of the pandemic, and once again for decades, way before the pandemic, just how folks are marginalized and disenfranchised. So I feel a little despair about that, but I also feel a great deal of hope by the small random acts of kindness, the acts of love that I've witnessed since this pandemic has started. I find a great deal of hope that I mentioned for 30 years. I've served in the community that when I was in grad school last year, the younger folks, Nerissa, I find hope in you. I find hope in all the young folks that are coming up that are looking and self-reflecting, knowing that deep diving, self-reflection is one of the scariest things we can do as human beings. But people are doing it, so I find a great deal of hope in that. I find an extreme amount of hope that the world that we live in now, that there are still people that can dream and people that hope to reimagine a better future. So I look forward to that. I said I'm 61. I'm tired. For 3 decades, I've done the heavy lifting and I'm tired. So I see the cavalry coming and all of you younger folks that are coming through the program. So you all give me great hope and inspiration.
All right. Well,
So
I
let me just
cannot.
let me just
Oh,
say
go ahead, Tom.
okay. Larissa, I'm counting on you. All right.
Oh God.
Don't burn it down. You're gonna find a way to build it up. And Brian, I remember I'm 70, right? So I was at a retreat with Elaine Penderhughes, right? Who's 86, right? And I said something to her like what you just said. And she almost like slapped me. What are you talking about? You know, you're 61. Come on, man.
We're all a spring chicken compared to someone else. So well, this I am so grateful, and on behalf of everyone who has been able to get to listen to the three of you and to take the insight and wisdom and hope. This is an intense year, an intense moment, an intense couple of weeks going into November 3rd, and really an intense time coming out of it. I think we all need to see both the importance of that election, but the importance of so much work around it, and the importance of the way that social workers can be part of the lobbying, the potential, the radical change made in large and small steps afterwards by just reimagining what's possible. And you are helping us do that. So thank you. And this will be recorded. You can come back to it. As Dr. Lewis says, if we are not going to be on the side of the poor, who is? And so let's keep at it.
Okay.
Thanks, everyone.
Oh, okay.
Oh, you can say one more thing, Nerissa.
I just didn't know if people were going to ask questions or not. That's why I just.
Well, I promised that Dr. Lewis could get off at 1:15, but
Okay.
people can stay on for questions
Okay.
if
Thank
they
you.
want. So thank you so much, Dr. Lewis.
Take care, Dr. Lewis.
Okay.
Thank you.
But now it's true, we could turn to questions if folks
If
want
I can
to.
figure out how to get out of it.
Otherwise, people can just email. That's fine too.
All right.
Have you found your way out yet, Dr. Lewis? There you go. Okay. Wow, Nerissa, so nice of you to put that in there. Oh, cute. That was Ellen's. That was a family related Smith. Okay.
Cool. Okay. Well,
Anybody on have a question? There's a few enough people that you could just unmute.
all right. I guess not.
Well, take care, everybody.
This was just awesome, and I want to say thank you.
Wow.
You're welcome. Thank you for coming.
Take care.
Take care, everyone.
Bye, everyone.